ready to go?
Yeah, will you remind me before we start, what is this? This is the tips, tricks, and I always forget the name of the webinar.
It's teaching tricks, tips, and ideas series.
It's
Innovation series.
It's a mouthful. All right, so innovation series. Can we just call it the innovation series?
Sure. Yeah, you can call it the innovation series. But yeah, it's teaching tricks, tips, and ideas innovation series. I will be turning off people's cameras and microphones just so we don't have any feedback during the presentation. But when Dana does questions, you are free to turn back on your microphones and your cameras. So we only do that just during the presentation. We will be monitoring the chat for any questions that you have. So please feel free to put any questions you have in the chat. And we want to thank you for joining us, and I will turn it over to Andy. And with that, we will get rolling.
All right, thanks, Gabby. Hi, everybody. I'm Andy McMahon. I'm one of the co-principal investigators on the CREATE Center, and it is my pleasure today to be to introduce our presenter, Dana Brown Haine. She, as part of our Teaching Tips, Tricks, and Ideas webinar series, and today she'll be exploring grid resilience as an approach to evaluating energy technology. Just a quick reminder before we get started, if you'd like to look at the resources CREATE has to offer, the website, createenergy.org, has all of our materials, including a recording of this webinar will be posted there in the future. Some upcoming events to tell you about quickly. We have a number of workshops and other professional development opportunities coming up over the summer. And our next webinar will be in April on Scanifly, the next generation of energy technology. It's using drones to help with solar siting and other renewable energy applications. There is a virtual KidWind workshop happening next week on March 9th. On the topic of building automated systems. And our next upcoming coffee hour later this month will be on the topic of free stuff for educators. So please join us for that as well. Today, our presenter, Dana Brown Haine, is the K-12 Science Education Manager for the UNC Institute for the Environment Center of Public Engagement in Science. She's been a leading energy-related teacher professional development experiences since 2009, and is the program director for the North Carolina Energy Literacy Fellows Program, a year-long professional development experience for secondary STEM educators. In 2018, Haine received North Carolina's Outstanding Informal Educator Award in Science, Mathematics, and Technology Education from the North Carolina Science, Mathematics, and Technology Education Center. And in 2022, she received the Outstanding Informal Educator Award from Repower School. She is also a member of the National Visiting Committee for the Environmental and Natural Resource Technology Center, or the EARTH Center, which is another one of our ATE national centers. And she is currently pursuing her PhD in Teaching and Learning STEM at NC State in Raleigh, North Carolina. Dana, please take it away. Thank you for being here today.
Yeah, thank you. Let me share my screen in a second. All right, I'll show all windows. I'm having trouble here finding some. Okay, hold on a second. My thing has like disappeared on me. I think because I changed my viewing.
So while Dana's looking for that, I'll just say that if you have questions or anything, feel free. I think we'll leave some time at the end for questions for Dana. So you got it? All right, perfect.
All right, does that work? Are you seeing the whole presentation?
We see the presentation and your slide notes to the right.
Oh, weird. Okay, let me just change that. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. It's weird having two screens. Well, hello, everyone, and thanks for having me here today to share with you one of the newer lessons that I've written as part of my work doing energy education for North Carolina STEM teachers. I wrote this lesson during the pandemic when we were all stuck at home. So it was a good time to do this, and it's still very relevant, just given all the things happening in terms of natural disasters and our power grid. So this lesson that I'm going to be talking with you about today, I did design it for high school STEM teachers, but it certainly could be taken up a notch to the college level or even down a notch to the middle school level. And I hopefully will have time at the end of this to talk about ways you could adapt it for your students. This definitely kind of more of a minds-on activity, systems thinking, so a little bit different than maybe some of the hands-on stuff many of you already teach. So one of the really big inspirations for my work with educators has been Gretchen Bache's book, The Grid, which came out in 2016. We read it in our program, and there's just so many rich quotes and great stories that could be used in education. But I liked this quote from her, and it really has set me on this path to helping educators learn about where electricity comes from and just the whole energy system. So this quote about the grid, it's the world's largest machine and the 20th century's greatest engineering achievement, and we are remarkably oblivious to it. Unless, of course, our power goes out, then we become more aware of it. And so part of my programming with teachers is to help them learn how to support students in building their literacy about the electrical system. So in my work, as Andy mentioned, I do lead a teacher professional development program called the North Carolina Energy Literacy Fellows Program. It's for grades 8 through 12 STEM educators. We have a lot of CTE instructors that go through the program, as well as science teachers, particularly environmental science and physical science teachers. They learn all about electricity. We get out on the ground and we tour as many different power generation facilities as we can. This is the group in 2019 at a solar farm in Eastern North Carolina. So we really try to get them out to see these facilities on the land, but also so they can meet the people who are working at these facilities and see all the different educational levels represented as well, so that they can be aware of what jobs might be out there for their students. And then back to Gretchen Bache's book about resilience. Resilience, in her opinion, and this seems to be true for me too, resilience stepped out as a well-developed philosophy of energy security because of Hurricane Sandy. So Hurricane Sandy happened, I believe, in 2012, and that really just, resilience, that's when a lot of things started happening in terms of people thinking about resilience and the power grid. And we've seen also, we've had many more disasters, many of which are climate related. So this is from NOAA. Many of you might already be aware of this site, but we know that over the past here, this is showing 30 years or more, we're seeing more billion-dollar disaster events, many of which are climate related. And also there are these annual maps that NOAA puts out summarizing these big billion-dollar weather and climate disasters. And undoubtedly, all of these impact the electrical grid. And so one thing I like about this approach of grid resilience is you get to teach students about the electrical grid while also kind of emphasizing what climate change is and what it looks like and how are we preparing for a world where more of these events are going to be happening. But with the resilience lens, we're also focusing on solutions and innovation and jobs, et cetera. So I feel like that's a way of kind of lumping all this together and to hopefully inspiring students to want to learn more. Another opportunity that this topic brings up is for teachers to tie this to local news issues. And so these are just some of the snapshots of headlines coming out about how these different climate related events are impacting the grid. So here's one about wildfire in California and the power grid. We also have, this is from the Carolinas, severe storms bringing down power lines. This is very common in North Carolina and probably where many of us live. Extreme heat is also increasingly becoming problematic and even beyond what we typically think of as the summer, but we have extreme heat days sometimes in May and sometimes in September. So on the edges of these summer seasons, but heat and humidity causing power outages, and then also flooding and hurricanes. So lots of opportunities here to pull in local news stories and videos for your students. And one part of the lesson that I'll be talking about is getting them to evaluate which energy sources might be most resilient to the weather hazards that are most common to students' communities. So this brings me to the lesson, and this is just a quote that I like about the lesson from a teacher who reviewed it. The lesson framed the grid in a personal, relevant way, which sparked both questions and lively discussion amongst my students. My students were highly engaged. So this was from a North Carolina environmental science teacher. And this is a photo here from one of our beach towns after a hurricane. So there's also lots of great pictures you can pull to share with your students. These are some of the main features of the lesson. So there is a lesson plan that you can read through, and I typically write these for like a new teacher, someone who's maybe not as familiar with the content. They can really walk through this, but many teachers take this and adapt it as they want. There are opportunities to bring in local news stories, like I've already mentioned. So that's one feature of the lesson. And then we also have worksheets, which are also Google documents, so that you can modify the worksheets accordingly, that just guide through the students through exploring an energy source and thinking about how that energy source is vulnerable to climate impacts, but also how it can be made to be more resilient. And I'll walk you through those in just a moment. It also connects to the National Climate Assessment that came out in 2018. So you could have students read excerpts from that. This is a screenshot of just their kind of executive summary where they have 3 key messages. Chapter 4 is exclusively devoted to the topic of energy supply, delivery, and demand. So that could be a good resource. And we also use figures from the National Climate Assessment chapter. That's that bottom right figure. And then it's also a great opportunity to use mapping tools and to think about the whole landscape for your state, the energy landscape for your state or for your region. So I'm going to just highlight some of these, and I look forward to hearing, which of these kind of features maybe excites you that you might think about using with your students. A lot of curriculum connections. I've already mentioned some of these, so I'm not going to reread this list. But I think career connections is another one. And something else that really can come out here, and this might be where this is really relevant to what some of you teach, is the need for innovation and how there's still a lot of ways that we need to make the grid more resilient. And some of these things haven't been solved yet, right? So I think that's another really neat opportunity for this lesson. The lesson starts by having students think about, what do we lose when we lose power? And there are so many different ways you could do this with students. You could have them journal how they use electricity within 24 hours, or even just since they woke up this morning. And one big reason for this particular prompt is to try to get students to think beyond just themselves and their cell phones, right? But to think about the public safety benefits of electricity in terms of traffic lights and elevators, for instance, to think about how they might use their credit card, at the grocery store. So this could really be a pretty robust discussion with your students, depending on your instructional goals. But a nice way to wrap it up, this is a figure from the National Climate Assessment that just shows how central electricity is to our lives and to so many of the systems, right, that power our daily lives, our jobs, our just everything. And so sometimes I think students need to be reminded of this because it's so embedded in our culture and our lives that we forget how central it is. So this is just one connection to the National Climate Assessment. It's also an opportunity to remind students or teach students about kind of the anatomy of the grid. So reminding them that we have these different power generation facilities, like a coal-fired power plant or a hydropower plant. We have these really large transmission lines that are shown here on the left. I don't know if my little labels, there we go. Transmission lines, we have substations, and then distribution lines, the smaller electrical lines leaving substations going out to end users like houses and businesses and schools. And so when we're talking about a power outage, typically you could lump the causes into 2 big categories. There's disruption to generation of electricity, and that could also include supply chain disruptions, as well as just distribution of electricity. So the power plant might work, but we might not be able to get power out to those end users. And so that kind of leads into the first part of the lesson. And there is a worksheet that can guide students through this. I know many of you probably teach at college, and you might, not want to use worksheets, but this could still guide how you could, facilitate student learning in their class. But there are different ways you could do the lesson. The way that it's kind of currently written is to assign students a particular energy source that's relevant to their state. These here are the ones that are most relevant to North Carolina. And so each group would have their own energy source, and they kind of walk through the steps on the far right here. They would map the energy landscape for this energy source. They would consider the system. So they would think about transmission lines. Where do the raw materials come from? So they would think about the whole life cycle of their energy source. And then they would think about how climate impacts that energy source, like how extreme heat might impact it, for instance. So they'll think about those vulnerabilities, and then they'll move into thinking about solutions. How can that energy source be more resilient moving forward? Feel free to stop me if there are any questions. So this leads them to go, there's this, I love the Energy Information Administration website. You can go here and look up your state, and the latest data is for 2020. You can just see the different, major contributors to your power sector. So again, this is North Carolina. So this might be where we start, is having them look at this electricity portfolio and talk about why we have this diverse portfolio of electrical resources. And then we map the energy landscape. This is another tool that I love, and students really enjoy it because it's interactive, and you can create different layers. So right now, this is showing just power plants, but you can see all the solar energy facilities are those yellow circles. You can see how many of them we have in our state of North Carolina. And then you can actually click on specific ones to get more information. And this is actually a great, just an aside, this is a great way to find some facilities that you might want to visit with students. So great field trip locator as well. And I know I see there's a question. Destruction, yes. Are you referring to the sabotage in Moore County?
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen that YouTube video. Pretty interesting, because they actually use the EIA map to find that interconnection point, and was it shut down the west side of Fort Bragg there?
Yes, yeah, and I was actually there that weekend, so it was really wild for me to be a part of that. And then I got on the map and I looked it up, and I was able to figure out like where they shot the two substations. It was very cool. Yeah, and so that leads to another point, like the inquiry that can come from this, like just having your students play with this and create, take an event maybe and figure out, well, why was it disrupted? That can be a great exercise. So the students map where the power plants are. And for many sources, they also can think about things like pipelines and transmission lines, railways, et cetera. So these two maps on the right get them thinking about the bigger system. And so for resilience, we want students to think about the whole system and not just the coal power plant, for instance, but how does the coal get to the power plant, et cetera. So that's one thing I love about this mapping activity. Let me go forward. There we go. I don't know what this says. So, in their groups, they would then think about relevant climate impacts. And so that's going to be different depending on, whether the energy source, needs water, for instance, or does it rely on shipments of coal? So this can be different for each group, but each group would think about what are those relevant climate impacts, and the worksheet guides them into thinking about, is extreme heat one of the impacts? Is ice an impact? Is drought an impact? So that's where you it's a way for you to kind of reinforce like what climate change is, what it looks like. Because I think some people still don't really understand like what we're really talking about when we're talking about climate change. And this is a nice way to do that. And then they think about vulnerabilities. So how is their particular energy source and that whole life cycle vulnerable to those climate impacts they identified? And this is a graphic from the National Climate Assessment that we use, and I keep wanting to make a newer version of this that's kind of like relevant to our state, for instance. I haven't had the time to do that yet, but this is nice because it prompts them to think about kind of that life cycle, because there's roads here and railways and pipelines. And so the students can go in, we encourage them to go in and think about, use this interactively. So, digitally, they could make a Google slide and create these little Post-it notes. But here, this is actually student work. These are student answers, the yellow Post-it notes. They were showcasing the impact of cold weather on the grid. So here they weren't focusing, I think, on a particular energy source, but just how does cold weather impact the different aspects of the grid. So that's why there are different ways you could kind of do this lesson if you wanted. But I like that this part could be really interactive. And then there also is kind of like a little answer key. It's not comprehensive, but this is actually from the report. So you can see kind of what was said in the National Climate Assessment about each of these steps and how they're vulnerable to these different climate impacts. And I don't know if there's another question, just prompt me. Yeah, it's definitely concerning. That then leads, so once they've identified vulnerabilities, they then start thinking about solutions. And there are many different kinds of solutions. Some are policy solutions, some are, grid hardening that was just mentioned in the chat. So really making the grid more resilient. Some might be through behavior changes, right? Like we saw this over Christmas in North Carolina. They were asking people to conserve energy so that we didn't have to experience blackouts because of the extreme cold temperatures. So just some behavioral change could be solutions, but there might be solutions also with like materials, like thinking about how to keep ice from forming on wind turbines, for instance. So lots of material science potential as well. You all probably know more of these solutions than I do, but that's one thing I really like about this lesson is it gets students thinking about those. And I did create, and I'll show you maybe when I stop sharing, an answer key, a pretty comprehensive answer key that helps the instructor kind of know what some of these solutions are. And it really encourages students to go out and do their own research to find examples of people cultivating these solutions, either through research or through small businesses, for instance. So that's another area of inquiry is there's so many solutions that they could look into. And then the answer key has also been reviewed by utility experts. So I tried to capture to make sure it was accurate and really showcasing all the different types of solutions that exist. And I'll show you that because I'm almost done. And so after every group's kind of done that, what you could then do is come back together and kind of synthesize everyone's what they have found. They could do presentations about their energy source, or you could maybe just focus on some of these climate events that are most relevant in your region. But as a class, collectively, they might think about which energy sources are most vulnerable to particular impacts. So if you were going to be rebuilding, say, after a hurricane, or some of the teachers I work with did some projects after Hurricane Maria came through and devastated Puerto Rico, they gave their students the opportunity to think about how could Puerto Rico rebuild a grid to be more resilient. So that's one thing I like about this activity is students can start thinking about which ones are going to be best given the climate impacts that happen in a certain area. And this is a screenshot, the far right blue area here. This is from the National Climate Assessment as well. It's not a comprehensive list of solutions, but that's just another place for information. And that flies by, and hopefully I'm doing good on time. So let me just finish these slides and then we can have just discussion. But I did want to talk about, I'd love to hear from you all about how you already teach about this topic, how you might adapt this lesson, opportunities for extensions. So we'll come back to that. And I will go ahead and say that one thing that I usually do after I do this lesson, we've done this lesson with teachers and workshops and also with students in our summer program. And this usually feeds really nicely into teaching about microgrids, and microgrids being one solution that promotes resilience. This is a photo of a microgrid in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And they built this solar battery system to provide power to this fire tower. And then one benefit is they no longer had to maintain vegetation, along these power lines. So that's another kind of a side benefit to this. And I like this quote, and so that's what I wanted to kind of end with. is as we think about resilience, we also think about this kind of new version of reliability, and communities and individuals can begin generating renewable electricity on their own to improve reliability in a world where that is now less certain. The time is right for this change as solar PV systems and battery storage become less expensive. So this quote was, in the context of microgrids, but we are seeing increasingly, right, the need to improve reliability in this world where it's less certain because of natural disasters, because of things like terrorism, et cetera. Squirrels, right? That's what caused I think vegetation. It was vegetation that caused the 2003 blackout, I believe, not squirrels, but squirrels are a big cause as well. This lesson focuses a lot on the climate impacts, but you could certainly take this broader and to think about all the other things that impact the grid. This work is possible because of the Duke Energy Foundation. They have funded my work for many years now, and I really enjoy working with teachers to promote energy literacy. This is one of our teachers walking out of a wind turbine in eastern North Carolina. It's our only wind farm in the state. That's a really neat aspect of our program, is we get to take teachers to these places that they might not normally be able to go. And I will show you my contact information and recognize all the people who helped me make this lesson, including some folks from Duke Energy, also the Department of Environmental Quality in North Carolina, and then a number of teachers. And if you're interested in the lesson, and I'll show you the lesson in just a moment, but this little QR code, if you want to scan it, will take you to the lesson online. And there's my email as well, and I'll drop that into the chat in just a moment. So I'm going to escape this, and I was just going to show you, let me stop sharing, and then I'll start sharing again so I can just show you the lesson. Let's see if this works. So this is the lesson. You can just see it's PDF. Can you see my screen? I hope you can. So I just kind of talked through a lot of this, but I was just going to show you the answer key because I think that's what I really spent so much time on. But this is where, I described the climate event and then identified vulnerabilities. So all this blue text is kind of like an answer key. And that was what was really closely reviewed by experts, and then identify solutions. But you could see how we divided it up, like thinking about vulnerabilities to grid infrastructure, vulnerabilities to thermal power plants, also vulnerabilities to renewables. So I kind of separated those. And then if you glance at the solutions, you'll see a whole range of things, and you might see some things relevant to things you already teach about. So things like burying power lines, managing vegetation, backup generators, microgrids, advanced communications, and smart meters. What else comes up here? I was just looking at other things, solar panels, de-icing, the colors of things, different technologies, especially around wind turbines. There we go. I'm just making sure I'm saying everything I want to say. But anyway, that's there. This probably needs to be updated since it's been a little more than 2 years. But it's a nice starting point, and I do also offer prompts in there, like where your students maybe could go and do some more research to find out more. And that lesson was also available. There's a website, there's a clearinghouse of climate and energy related lessons called the Climate Literacy and Energy Awareness Network, or CLEAN. And the lesson is posted there, but there are also many other lessons there. And if you don't know about CLEAN, and I'll try to drop the link into the chat, that's a great way to go find some videos and lessons. And they do go up through grades, like grades K through 16, I believe. So they are trying to, target college level as well. But all the lessons have been reviewed by educators as well as science education experts and, people kind of in the field. So they've been kind of vetted, which is nice. And I think with that, I'd love to open it up to questions and comments, and maybe hear what some of you are thinking or what you already teach about in regards to grid resilience and how you might use this. So feel free to drop a question in the chat, or you can unmute yourself.
Dana, that was fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
I will give folks a second if anybody has a question. If not, I can start with a couple. Well, so I'll start off then, Dana. So I know you've developed quite a few lessons, kind of in a similar vein, and I wonder, kind of, when you design these, are they kind of meant to dovetail into the other lessons? Or, I mean, I know this is a standalone lesson by itself, but I feel like kind of it could also be used as kind of a lead in to some other lesson. And I'm kind of curious how you think about that when you're developing these.
Yeah, I do tend to think about them in isolation. And I probably should think about making them more like flowy, but another reason for this lesson that I forgot to mention was that I had a conversation with a teacher a couple of years ago who had said how he was kind of just bored of teaching about the pros and cons of energy sources, which is what they kind of ask our science teachers to teach about. And so another reason for this lesson was it still gets students thinking about the pros and the cons, but in the context of climate change and grid resilience. So I think that, so to kind of answer your question, I think this is an activity that could be a nice follow-up. Once they've learned about the different types of energy sources, it's a nice follow-on. Or it could be how you introduce them to these different energy sources too. So I find, the challenge with writing lessons is you don't want it to come across as being like prescriptive, like this is what you're supposed to do. It's more of like I think of it more as an offering, like here's some work I've done for you. And take what you want, take the best pieces of it that work for your instruction. So I try to showcase that, but then also support the teachers who really, might be first year teachers and really are going to go through it, line by line and do it that way. So I like to think of myself as a connector who has the time to do some of the stuff that the teachers might not have time to do. Does that answer your question?
No, it absolutely does. Yeah, thank you.
Dana, I had a question. When you were talking about the microgrid for the fire tower, you said that would allow them not to have to deal with vegetation anymore.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure what you meant by that.
So they no longer need electrical lines running up to the tower.
Oh, okay.
So they kind of, that whole corridor of electrical lines can be neglected now. So now it's a more self-sufficient, operation. And I hadn't thought about that until someone, was like, hey, now we don't have to keep the trees trimmed, right? Because there's no power lines anymore. So yeah, that's what I was referring to. And again, there are going to be land use issues that come up with microgrids because some can be quite big. And so it's not like they're free of any consequences, but it's those trade-offs, and so I think that's another aspect of all of this is just thinking about the trade-offs with all of these technologies.
Yeah, thank you. This is a great presentation. Very thorough. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's really a fascinating topic. And in our state, we have, I don't know how many microgrids, we're getting more of them. Duke Energy just opened one, I think, in Hot Springs, North Carolina, to power a small remote Western North Carolina community, to keep it powered during big power outages. So that's another thing, is to talk about the different kinds of microgrids, the different functions to promote resilience as well. And I do see a question. Let's see. In an international context, it would be interesting to compare resilience. Yeah, so I haven't really gone there yet. So someone's asking just about the international context. But yeah, I think that would be really interesting. That's a nice idea for an extension. And then Germany buries many more miles of electrical lines and therefore has fewer related outages. That would be interesting data. Yeah, and a lot of people do say, well, why do we not have more buried lines? But then there's a cost to that, right? Like it's more expensive to bury lines. So that's getting back to the trade-offs. And it might be harder to fix buried lines because they're going to be harder to access, if something goes wrong. So I think thinking about the pros and cons of that. But you could have students think about it for their community, you know, what makes sense in their community. I will offer something else that we do with students, and I do it with teachers. That's been a lot of fun. And this also was in response to the pandemic. Was we use Goose Chase Scavenger Hunt, which is a phone app. And I created missions for them to go out in their communities and look for things like buried power lines, overhead power lines, you know, substations, transformers, evidence of a power outage. Like it was kind of fun for them, but it gets them out. Some of them even took their families along, and they were just basically finding these different things in their communities. And that's another way you could enhance your instruction, is to have students do that, you know, within their communities.
Yeah, so Dana, I guess I had one more comment more than anything about the way that you've designed this. And I really do like the way that it is, and you mentioned it a little bit before, it's not just about one technology, but it's more about getting them to think about systems, thinking about anything, right? And I think it does open up the opportunity to talk about things like policy, right? Big picture ideas that might be beyond some students' current, you know, thinking, but it kind of puts it into a context that is more realistic and obtainable to them. So I really appreciate that approach to this lesson.
Yeah, and I do want to update it soon, and I want to build in more of a people element, because like, I don't remember, maybe it was Jim who asked about the Moore County sabotage. And what was so upsetting about that was, you know, that happened in December in that pretty cold weekend. And like, it's like, did these people even think about all the people that were going to be impacted for days? Like medically vulnerable people, right, who were reliant on respirators at their home, people storing medicine or breast milk. I mean, there were traffic accidents. So just really thinking about that ripple effect. And then when you have some power outage that lasts for days, just the whole economic, you know, outfall from that. So yeah, I think we probably all can vouch for that. We need more people who understand systems, right? And how people are relying on these systems.
Well, Dana, thank you very much. Are there any other questions that we would like to for Dana before we close today? Well, in that case, then, Dana, thank you again for being here.
Thank
this
you.
is fantastic. We really appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for attending. And look forward to seeing you at our next event. Gabby, do you have any closing remarks you would like to add?
So this has been recorded, and I will get it up on the Create website probably about middle of next week. So if you would like to go back to the recording, it will be available to you on the events tab up on the Create website. Other than that, I want to thank you for joining us, and have a fabulous weekend.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dana.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Have a
Thanks,
good week.
Dana.
Thanks, Dana. Nice job moderating, Andy.
Thank you. Oh, so that was Ken on the iPhone. I didn't know who that was.
Yeah.